Night settles on Castile, like ash after a burnt offering. Lanterns flicker along the ramparts of a walled city, their trembling light painting the stone in bands of amber and shadow. Inside a vaulted church, a girl stands beneath a canopy, her eyes lifted not to the man beside her, but to the slow-breathing darkness of the nave. She is barely more than a child. He is a king, all compass and crown, a figure carved out of iron will and old maps. In her pale hands a vow, in his a claim to a throne that runs like a crack through the heart of Iberia. The year is 1475, the place is Plasencia. The girl is Juana of Castile, La Beltraneja to her enemies, 12 or 13, depending on which chronicle you trust. The man is Afonso V of Portugal, 43 and unblinking, a veteran of campaigns across the strait and of years bent under the weight of a crown. They stand before the altar with a promise that defies canon and custom, a promise braided from need, ambition, and the brittle thread of blood, a promise the Pope has not yet blessed. The torches inch lower, the banners hang heavy, and somewhere outside a rider is already moving through the dark, carrying letters that will open a war. If you listen closely, you can hear the quiet hinge of history as it turns. Before we step inside that church and understand why a king would take his niece as his wife, let's step into the silence that came before, into a world where ritual, more than reason, drew lines men dared not cross, until one finally did. If stories like this, quiet, unsettling, and built on the hidden gears of history, speak to you, consider joining us. Subscribe and like this video not for noise, but so that, together, we can keep walking these dim corridors where the past still breathes. What happened in Plasencia was not just a marriage, it was a ritual weapon. But to see the blade, we must first understand the forge.
Long before the vows were spoken in that Castilian church, people believed that invisible order required visible rites. Rituals were not decoration, they were scaffolding. They held up the world. In antiquity, the most intimate boundaries of the body, who could touch whom, who could marry whom, were not merely private choices, they were maps of duty carved into flesh and law. Marriage was sanctuary and contract, sacrament and strategy. It could bind tribes, stitch rifts between families, or yoke two crowns together until neither could move without dragging the other behind. By the Middle Ages, Latin Christendom had covered kinship with a lattice of rules. After the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, consanguinity, blood relationship, was measured to the fourth degree. Uncle and niece sat well within the prohibited bounds. If they were to marry, they needed more than earthly will. They needed a dispensation, a formal untying of the knot by Rome. The Church insisted that kin distance kept the sacred order from collapsing inward, but the Church also understood kings. Where crowns met crises, exceptions were carved in ink, sealed in lead, and sent like lifelines through the post. In Iberia, a frontier world constantly jolted by war, alliance, and trade, ritual held a special weight. Here, oaths were hammered in front of Cortes, banners were laid on altars, coins bore not just kings' faces, but the grammar of their legitimacy. In grand cathedrals and cramped chancelleries, power spoke in liturgy and parchment. And sometimes, when the logic of kingdom against kingdom knotted too tight for swords to cut, it was marriage that untied it or pulled it tighter. Consider the girl whose very name became a weapon, Juana of Castile, daughter of King Henry IV and Queen Joan of Portugal, Afonso V's sister. Her birth splintered Castile with whispers about her father's failure to produce an heir and about the child's paternity, whispers her enemies sharpened into a blade. Was Juana legitimate, the rightful queen, or an interloper, a pawn named La Beltraneja, after a powerful courtier, Beltran de la Cueva, whom the rumor-mongers claimed as her true sire? The question was not asked in private, it was shouted across cities, courts, and church doors. These were not just gossip's gusts, these were storms that moved armies. The most important thing to understand is this. In late medieval Iberia, ritual didn't merely reflect power, it made power. A coronation was not a celebration, it was a conjuring. A marriage was not a romance, it was a rite that could snag a crown and haul it into a different pair of hands. And if the shortest path to Castile's heart ran through a girl whose blood tied Portugal to its prey, what would a king do when the church's door stood half open, when time ran thin, when the banners were already unfurling in his enemy's camp? A king would test the limit of ritual, would step into the zone the law forbade, and wait to see whether Rome blinked. But what exactly were those forbidden lines, and how often in the long record of human belief had people crossed them and survived?
Start with a truth that feels like a rumor. What we now call forbidden was often, somewhere, sometime, a form of devotion. In pharaonic Egypt, sister-wife queens stood not merely as spouses, but as pillars of divine order. The royal family mirrored the gods, and the gods were a family. Marriage within tight loops of kin reinforced a cosmic symmetry. To step outside would have been to break the mirror. In Zoroastrian Persia, the concept of quidoda permitted certain close kin unions, including uncle-niece marriages, as ways of preserving spiritual and familial purity within a sacred community. It was a theological structure, not a scandal. The rite guarded not just blood, but belief. In Hellenistic courts, after Alexander scattered kingdoms like seeds, dynasties coiled inward. Queens were cousins, nieces, and sometimes both. The ritual logic was stark. Keep power close enough to guard it, and blood close enough to ground it. The price, genetic or moral, was a problem for the future. The present had empires to hold. In medieval and early modern Europe, canon law set strict limits on consanguinity, but dispensations were tools as much as teachings. The Church recognized that among rulers, marriage was often a diplomatic cable. To cut it too simply would drop kingdoms into chaos. Isn't it striking that some of the same centuries that preached against close-kin marriage also papered over it case by case in exchange for reasons of state? Even within Catholic monarchies famous for their public piety, precedents emerged. Consider the Habsburgs, who threaded Europe with a net of marriages that often knitted cousins, and in some cases uncle and niece. King Philip II of Spain, for example, married his niece Anna of Austria in 1570 with papal approval. She was in her mid-teens, and the union was framed as a restoration of ties within a divided Habsburg house. The language was unity, the method was intimacy. Through all of this, one principle held. Ritual could sanctify what otherwise would be condemned. If the correct words were spoken, the correct seal pressed, the correct altar kissed, then even a union inside the Church's red lines could be brought into its pale. Not erased, transformed. So why did Afonso V's choice feel to his contemporaries like a boundary pushed to its brittle edge? Because the ink was not yet dry or even granted on the dispensation that would have sanctified it.
Because the girl at the center was not just kin, but claim. Because this was not nephew to niece to slow the spiral of inheritance, but uncle to niece to snatch a rival crown. And because the rival he offended was not a mere noble, but the woman who would become known as Isabella the Catholic, hard-eyed, determined, and perfectly attuned to ritual's power herself. Against such a figure, marriage became more than a ceremony. It became a siege engine aimed at a throne. If the church hesitated, if Rome wavered, if the altar remained silent, isn't that when rulers began to invent their own sanctities? Watch now as the forbidden practice ceases to be a curiosity of distant lands and becomes, in Iberia, the trigger of a war.
Why did people believe? Why did literate clerks and illiterate soldiers alike invest so much meaning into a rite conducted between two people on a small square of floor in a single church on a single day? Because beneath the banners, ritual soothed fear. The fear that the world might be nothing but force and fraud. The fear that crowns were only metal, oaths only sound. The fear that the dead had no voice and the future no judge. For ordinary people, rituals made power legible. The ringing of bells, the procession with candles, the recitation of formulae, these were not just pretty gestures, they were proof. A thing done properly was a thing done truly. The word properly hid its clause in the details. Under whose authority? On which altar? With which witness? If you knew the answers and they satisfied the rules you had been taught, you could rest inside their geometry. If ritual crowned a king, the king existed at a layer of reality higher than violence, closer to God. For rulers, rituals provided an answer when reality refused to cooperate. Henry IV of Castile had real problems. Factional nobles, storms in the treasury, doubts about heirs. Those problems birthed rumors. Rumors shaped reality. When his daughter Juana was born in 1462, rivals whispered about his potency, about the queen's fidelity, about a court favorite whose name Beltran would cling to Juana like a brand. In the absence of laboratory certainty, medieval politics crawled toward ritual certainty. Henry had Juana sworn in as heir. He led oaths as if words could still the waters. But when he died in 1474, oaths cracked. Two realities rushed in to fill the space, one where Juana was queen, another where his half-sister Isabella was. For a king like Alfonso V, ritual offered a bridge into that contested terrain. He could call himself Juana's lawful husband. He could call himself the lawful defender of her right. He could stand at an altar and assume a role larger than uncle, larger than neighbor, even larger than king. In the ceremony's shadow, a kingdom far beyond his borders might become his realm's second heart. Imagine what that does to a mind trained on crusade and court, on the geometry of banners in the wind and the iron scent of victory. Imagine believing, truly, that God delights in order and that you, by arranging these rites correctly, can induce him to favor your cause. What about the girl at the center? Chroniclers are sparing with her voice, yet we can glimpse her outline. Juana signs letters later, decades later, as Yo la Reina, I the Queen. Not petulance. Identity. She is she who was proclaimed. She is she whom rituals made. She refuses a marriage set by treaty to erase her claim, preferring the silence of a convent to the noise of a public forgetting. What does that tell us? That even when the banners fall, the rites remain, written in a hand steadier than the historians sometimes allow.
Here is the hidden cost of ritual as weapon. It binds not just the body, but the self. Now step with me into Placentia. The hour is late. The papers are stacked. The men with pens have not slept. The Pope has not spoken clearly. And a king is about to make the silence mean what it needs it to mean. What happens when you ask heaven for permission and hear only your own heartbeat answer?
Afonso V of Portugal, O Africano, the African, named for his campaigns across the strait, was born in 1432. Crowned as a boy, tempered by regencies and rivalries, he grew into a monarch who understood both ceremony and steel. He led men into Morocco, took cities with names that flashed like coins in a chronicler's manuscript, Alcácer Seguer in 1458, Arzila in 1471, and returned to Lisbon to a court that watched him with a mixture of awe and unease. He had tested himself against walls and tides. Now he would test himself against law. Across the border, Castile seethed. Henry IV's death in December 1474 opened a fissure. Isabella, his half-sister, married to Ferdinand of Aragon in 1469, claimed the throne. Isabella's marriage itself had danced at the edge of ritual legality. Related within prohibited degrees, she and Ferdinand waited on a papal dispensation that was murky in its arrival and later regularized. But Isabella had a gift for making ambiguity look like providence. She knew how to turn a half-permitted rite into a destiny, and to make that destiny so visible that arguments seemed blasphemous. Against her, Juana's party rallied. They proclaimed the girl queen, elevated her at Placencia, and sent messages to Lisbon. The message to Afonso was not merely political, it was personal. Juana was his sister's child. If he married her, he would not be merely ally, but sovereign consort. He would not just back her claim, he would become the claim's body and blade. In May 1475, Afonso crossed into Castile. The marriage was conducted in Placencia, in the city that had hoisted the banner of Juana's cause. They sought a dispensation for the avunculate union, for uncle and niece to stand before God as man and wife. Rome hesitated or delayed. The letters did not bring firm sanction before the vows were made. This is the crucial point. In the fragile realm where ritual constructs power, hesitation can be as fatal as refusal. Was the marriage valid? In civil terms, it was made. In canonical terms, it waited on permission that did not clearly arrive. In political terms, it was a drumbeat, a declaration of intent hammered into the floor of a church. Whether the union was consummated is unclear in the record, and in any case, it is not necessary to know. The weapon was the rite itself. The consummation Afonso sought was not of bodies, but of crowns. The next months were a cyclone of movement and counsel. Armies assembled. Alliances tested their seams. Isabella's camp moved swiftly. Its message was relentless. We are order. We are the legitimate. We are the natural crescendo of God's plan. She and Ferdinand understood that news of legitimacy spreads in waves across parishes and markets. They sent letters ahead of their banners. Afonso met them on ground made slick by propaganda and blood. The Battle of Toro in March 1776 was sharp and uncertain. On the field, neither side won a clean, crushing victory, but Isabella's party won the narrative after the noise. They seized the story and made it sing their tune. Toro became in Castile's memory a proof that God favored their cause. And in politics, memory can be more lethal than spears. If the marriage had been a ritual invited to stand in for law, Toro proved that another ritual, battle, could stand in for truth. The king had wedded his niece to conquer a kingdom. He had instead married his cause to doubt. What does a king do when the walls of law and the weather of war both refuse him?
Alfonso sought France. In 1477, he crossed the Pyrenees to plead with Louis XI, the Spider King, master of webs and patience. Perhaps another ritual would save him, the right of negotiation, of kings facing kings, of treaties unrolled like scrolls over a long oak table. Louis smiled in that small, practiced way of his and gave little. Behind him, Europe leaned toward consolidation. Isabella and Ferdinand were not simply rivals, they were a hinge across which the continent would sooner pivot than buck. That same year, Afonso entrusted authority in Portugal to his son, a prince who would soon be king, João, the future John II, sharp, unsentimental, the sort of mind that understood both the value of ceremony and the flint beneath it. Some sources say Afonso contemplated abdication. Some describe his withdrawal from the noise of rule. What is certain is that he was tired. Wars of ink and incense can exhaust as thoroughly as wars of steel. Meanwhile, the marriage's status slid toward shadow. Without a clear dispensation, canon lawyers could stare down the vows and reduce them to ash. Rome's stance mattered because Iberia still needed the Church to make and unmake its bonds in public. But even Rome's voice had to travel across mountains and mines, and by the time it arrived, the reality in the field had already hardened. 4 years of war ended in 1479 with the Treaty of Alcáçovas. It did not grant Afonso a crown in Castile. It did something stranger. It redrew the map of the Atlantic future as compensation for the past. Portugal's rights in the waters it had already begun to master, the Azores, Madeira, Cape Verde, Guinea, were affirmed, while Castile clutched the Canaries. Think of it as a ritual exchange at a distance. You keep your inland crown, we keep our ocean road. Empire for empire. Well then, if marriage could not wrench one kingdom into another's arms, navigation could tie them together in rivalries that reached beyond sight. And the girl? Joanna did not marry the prince proposed by treaty, the child who would become a symbol of reconciliation, authored by those who had defeated her. She withdrew from public life and took religious vows in Portugal. In Coimbra, she lived long in the whispering quiet of a convent, signing letters, "I the Queen," as if to say that what ritual had declared in one high hour could never be rescinded by any hour after. She died in 1530, a ghost threaded through chancery books, refused by history the coronation she had been promised, and refused by herself the erasure she was offered in its place. The story could end here. The king who married his niece failed. The child who would be queen faded into stone halls and candle smoke. But history rarely leaves clean ends. It loves residues. It leaves questions that hang like incense after the priests have gone. What was the marriage in the end? A mistake? A transgression? Or a mirror held up to a world that preferred its taboos papered over rather than enforced? And is the most shocking ritual the one that transgressed the rules, or the one that turned that transgression into law? The marriage at Plasencia did not erupt from nowhere. It was a machine assembled from many parts, each one a ritual in itself. Proclamation. Juana's supporters had already proclaimed her queen after Henry's death. staging formal acknowledgements in which nobles pledged obedience, cities swore fidelity, and the logic of succession was hammered into collective memory. Every oath is a brick. Petition. Afonso's court sought a papal dispensation for avunculate marriage. The petitions moved through channels clogged by politics. Pope Sextus IV, a subtle navigator of Italian storms and European demands, weighed Iberian requests against the balance of power within and beyond the peninsula. Rome was not a servant, it was a broker. Proxy and presence. Marriages among royals were sometimes sealed by proxy when persons could not be present. In Plasencia, the presence was the point. Afonso's body in that church made his claim flesh. He was not a rumor, not a signature on a distant page. He was a king in a foreign city, standing before God. Witness. The attending nobles and clerics anchored the rite. Their presence signaled to others that this was not a private scandal, but a public event. Even the scandalized must admit it happened. Interpretation. Afterward came the fight over what it meant. Isabella's party argued canon. Afonso's party argued necessity. The truth would be what lasted. And what lasted was not formed by the most perfect logic, but by the most persistent, well-organized memory. When we call the marriage forbidden, we are not simply naming a moral boundary, we are describing how close Afonso brought politics to the altar and how tenuous the Church's grip felt in the face of a king who would not wait for its word. Rituals bind because they are staged correctly. A ritual performed out of order, without the proper permissions, without the proper intermediaries, can burst like a candle too quickly lit. And yet, even burst light casts a shadow. If you were there, if you had watched the girl's face, the way the torchlight freckled her knuckles, if you had heard the vows stitched together in that measured cadence, would you have believed, or would you have felt what the canons would later declare, that the shape was right, but the spirit wrong? What if both were true at once? Seen from Plasencia, the old examples, Egypt, Persia, Hellenistic courts, take on a different weight. They are not curiosities, they are warnings and invitations. They show how power, when pressed, turns inward. It seeks shorter paths between throne and blood, between symbol and state. In Catholic Europe, avunculate marriages were not standard, but they were not unimaginable. They required paperwork, penance, permission, layers to ensure that exception would not become rule. Philip II's later union with his niece, Anna of Austria, was sanctioned, framed as piety and repair. Afonso's union with Joanna was insistence ahead of permission, framed by his camp as necessity. It shows the difference between a dispensation used as capstone and a dispensation begged for as foundation. Beyond the legalities lies a colder truth. Royal children were political instruments long before they were persons to their courts. Boys were betrothed to girls they had never seen. Treaties were drafted on their bones. Ages shock us now. Then they were footnotes. What mattered was the geometry of the alliance and the theater of the ceremony. The age sitting beside Afonso that day was less an impropriety to his supporters than a symbol. Pliant youth, pliant future. We can recoil without condescension. We can judge without pretending we would have been brave in that hall, under those eyes. It is difficult to gainsay a right when your city's safety, your family's fortunes, perhaps your own skin, depends on believing it did what it said it did. But that is precisely what makes what comes next the most unsettling ritual of all.
It was not a marriage in a church, not a coronation in a cathedral, not a banner blessed before battle. It was a treaty at a table, and it undid a marriage more completely than Rome ever could.
Picture the room where Alcasavus was shaped. It is quieter than a church, less grand than a throne room, but more dangerous than both. Men lean over parchment, their voices controlled, their faces carved from the same wood as the furniture. Each signature is a sacrifice. Each seal pressed into wax is a pledge that will outlive the muscle that drove it. Treaties are secular sacraments. They do not require God to witness them, only the power of states to enforce them, and the memory of men to keep them. And in this room, the ritual is stark. Words cut away illusions. Portugal leaves Castile. Castile leaves Portugal. The marriage recedes into the narrow place where it had always truly lived. Not in the heart, not in the bed, not on the altar, but in the claws. The claws. Isn't that a cold word to have such heat? Here, the most shocking ritual unfolds. Not the forbidden marriage, but the sanctioned unmaking. A rite can sanctify, a rite can strip. If the Placentia vows turned scandal into sovereignty, Alcasavus turned sovereignty into history's quiet footnote, and all by the choreography of signatures that, unlike the murmured vows, no canon lawyer could later claim as invalid. The law wore its proper clothes. The altar, this time, never even had to be entered. After Alcasavus, time stretches. Afonso dies in 1481. Juana endures. People pass her cell and whisper her name, sometimes in pity, sometimes in scorn, sometimes in that peculiar tone reserved for the defeated powerful, a tone that fuses fear and relief. She writes. When she signs, "I, the Queen," she performs her own private ritual, stubborn and pure. Her handwriting is its own coronation, the fragile kind, the kind no one can witness, but no one can erase. If you had asked Isabella then, or Ferdinand, or John II of Portugal, or the Pope, was the marriage nothing? They might have said yes. But history prefers the shrug to the gavel. The truth was simpler and stranger. It happened. It mattered. It made a war. It rearranged an ocean. It broke a girl's public life and made a woman's private world. It carved, with a blade few noticed at the time, the borderlines of empires that would soon bend ships and souls to their shapes. Who needs thunder at the altar when ink and time can do so much more damage? It is tempting to make Afonso a villain, or Juana a victim, or Isabella a heroine. Stories crave clean roles, but the past, when we listen, refuses. Afonso was a man of his time and tools. He used them, and they broke. Juana was not a blank page. She wrote herself with a title no treaty could take. Isabella was a queen of iron will, who believed so hard in the order she made that the order came. The point is not to excuse. It is to stare at the mechanism as it turns and name its parts. Kinship, a web that both binds and strangles. Ritual, a language that tells the world what the world is. Law, a blade that cuts where ritual tells it to. Memory, the glue that fixes the cut so it cannot be undone. If you look closely, you can see the Van Dyck brown of an old painting, a girl with a crown that never quite sits. You can see a king with eyes fixed past the altar into a future he thinks he recognizes. You can see a queen with hands steady on the reins of a world that will carry her further than she can yet imagine. And behind them, beyond them,
You can see ships being built, their ribs rising in Portuguese yards like the bones of some new creature, their sails waiting to drink the wind. In 1475, a king married his niece to claim a neighboring crown. In 1479, he traded that crown for an ocean road. Which was the more shocking rite? The question is not merely historical, it is diagnostic. It measures what we are willing to count as sacred. It reminds us that we may recoil from one ritual and bow to another, though both can shape lives with equal ferocity. The church in Plasencia is quiet now. The torches are ash. The nave breathes out cold air against the faces of tourists and ghosts. You could stand where Afonso stood and feel nothing, or you could feel everything. Which one is more honest?
When people say, "the king who married his 12-year-old niece," they mean scandal. Let them. The scandal matters. It is moral. It is human. But something deeper is hidden under that phrase, something more unsettling and closer to the engine room of history. They mean a world where ritual could bend law until it broke, and then, after it broke, other rituals could gather the shards and make something new that cut even deeper. They mean a church where a child became a claim. They mean a hall where a man mistook a right for a guarantee. They mean the slow persistence of a woman who spent a lifetime answering to a title that her enemies had mocked into a nickname, and who refused to let the nickname be the last word. We live with the aftermath of those rooms. Treaties still undo vows. Vows still pretend to outrun treaties. People still stand in public and ask God to bless their maps. And the quietest things, signatures, oaths, still move armies. Stand with me for a moment longer in that church. Listen to the silence after the vows, the breath that everyone holds as if the world waits to be told what it is. Imagine the altar flickering. Imagine the doors pushing open. Imagine the night outside, the dark streets, the horses, the riders. History is not loud at first. It is a whisper that only sounds like thunder after it has already passed. The girl becomes a woman in the dim light of a cloister, her quill biting into paper that will outlast both her and us, and she writes, steady as a bell, "I, the Queen." And somewhere across water her uncle won by losing her crown. Sails fill, and the wind does what the church and the courts could not. It carries a kingdom into the future. The past does not end. It fades at the edges and deepens in the middle. If you want to find it, go to where a ritual once bent the rules and ask what filled the space it left. That answer will not roar. It will whisper. Listen long enough, and you will hear a king, a girl, a queen, and a sea. And you will not be able to say which of them moved first.